First reading is from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 12, verses 28 to 34. It's called the Most Important Commandment. One of the teachers of religious law was standing there listening to the debate. He realised that Jesus had answered well, so he asked, "Of all the commandments, which is the most important?" Jesus replied, "The most important commandment is this. Listen, O Israel, the Lord our God is the one and only Lord, and you must love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind, and all your strength. The second is equally important. Love your neighbour as yourself. No other commandment is greater than these." The teacher of religious law replied, "Well said, teacher. You have spoken the truth by saying that there is only one God and no other. And I know it is important to love him with all my heart and all my understanding and all my strength, and to love my neighbour as myself. This is more important than to offer all burnt offerings and sacrifices in the law." Realising how much the man had understood, Jesus said to him, "You are not far from the kingdom of God." And after that, no one dared to ask him any more questions. This is the word of the Lord.
And I am reading from Hebrews chapter 9, verses 11 to 14. "But when Christ came as a high priest of the good things that have come, then through the greater and perfect tent, not made with hands, that is, not of this creation, he entered once for all into the holy place, not with the blood of goats and calves, but with his own blood, thus obtaining eternal redemption. For if the blood of goats and bulls, with the sprinkling of the ashes of a heifer, sanctifies those who have been defiled so that their flesh is purified, how much more the blood of Christ, who came through the eternal Spirit, offered himself without blemish to God, purify our conscience from dead works to worship the living God." This is the word of the Lord.
Good morning, everybody. It's great to be here in Westonia this morning. It's kind of a nice little touch, I thought, when Tanya sat down over in this chair over the side there and looked up, and there's a picture of her grandfather as a baby looking down on us, and her grandfather's family. So it's nice to be home. Look, I've had a bit of a tough time with this sermon preparation the last couple of weeks, and as a result I came up with kind of 3 sermon directions, and it wasn't till Thursday that I decided on which one to go. So I actually have 3 separate stories I was going to tell, and 2 of them are deleted. So they're like the deleted scenes in the DVD that you watch. So if you're still awake at the end of the sermon and you still want more, yell out "deleted stories," and I'll give you those as well, just a little snippet of what we might have gone down. Okay. For those of you who were in church last Sunday, take courage. On your feet, Jesus calls you. Last Sunday we had David, who's an exceptional preacher, give us an excellent sermon, I thought, based on a brief interaction between a blind beggar Bartimaeus and Jesus as Jesus walks the road into Jerusalem. David noted that this was likely a very intentional exchange. If you remember, there's a crowd walking along and then a lone voice grabs Jesus' attention. So it's an intentional exchange, not only for Bartimaeus, who had his life transformed through his dramatic healing, but we think it was also important for the disciples as he involved them in the whole exchange and of course ultimately ourselves as the latest travellers to walk on this planet and to find our way in the world. So if you missed the sermon last Sunday, check it out on the website. Any sermon you like on the website, it's great. When it comes down to it though, the instruction or guidance is very simple and it's still relevant today. Take courage, on your feet, Jesus is calling you. Sounds simple, looks simple, a logical step in faith. But the question I've been struggling with all week is, so why is it so hard for us to respond as I think we surely need to? Why is it so hard? I was talking to one of our Kiwi shearers, Tom will grin about this, talking to one of our Kiwi shearers recently, and he was telling me how he was rummaging around behind an old tip, behind an old shearing shed that he was working in, and he found a bottle. Pity Grant Bennett's not here because he can go to the story. So he found this bottle. It wasn't just any old bottle. It was like nothing else he'd ever seen. It was so full of promise and mystery. Shearers aren't great thinkers. But before he knew it, he'd pulled the stopper out of the bottle to see if it had anything interesting in it. And what do you know? A cloud of smoke puffed out of it. And before he knew it, there was a large Asian-type man swaying before him with a turban on his head and a huge grin on his face. "Oh, bless you, my son," he said, "for you have done a great thing. And this is your lucky day. I've been stuck in that bottle forever, and now I'm free, and I'm here to grant you one wish, my son." "Oh, sweet as, bro. Yes, I know exactly what I need," the shearer said. "I've just bought this wicked, fully sick, top-of-the-line Ford Ranger, all the extras, but I really hate flying. So could you build me a wee bridge for me back to New Zealand so I can drive my wicked-ass ute home and show all my cousins?" The swaying stopped. The grin faded as the man thought about it. "Oh, what you ask for is a most difficult and challenging task. Is there any chance you might have another wish?" So my man thinks for a moment and he has a thought. "Bro, I'm off to Higgins shearing shed soon and I've heard they're weird religious, you know. And I'm in a bad way, bro. Drugs, booze, bad relationships, addictions of all kinds. So maybe it's time to take this God stuff seriously. Can you explain to me the meaning of life, the mysteries of God, and what all this Trinity business is all about?" The genie grows even more serious as he ponders the situation. He scratches his turban. "Would this bridge be going to the north or the south?" Sorry about that, it's not a very reassuring way to start a sermon, is it? But it's not easy, is it? It's not straightforward as we grapple to understand our place in eternity, grapple with our sinful natures, our willful pursuit of self-interest, as we deal with the damage and the hurts that comes with any of our lives. As humans, we've been blessed and we've been cursed with a thing called free will. Free will. The ability to choose, but it seems not often the capacity to choose well. The Old Testament largely chronicles the adventures of the nation of Israel, a people chosen by God to be His chosen ones. Yet time and time and time again, they reject Him and they go on their own way. They rebel and they ultimately suffer for it. We talk about the innocence of babies. We talked about it at our Bible study a couple of weeks ago. But it's my experience that babies, they learn to crawl, they learn to walk, and then they learn to stamp their foot and shout at you. It's as early as that. The Apostle Paul, perhaps the most influential Christian ever, makes a startling admission in Romans chapter 7 verses 18 to 20, and you would have all been familiar with it. He says, I realise, this is the greatest Christian ever, I realise that I don't have what it takes. I can will it, but I can't do it. I decide to do good, but I don't really do it. I decide not to do bad, and then I do it anyway. My decisions, such as they are, don't result in actions. Something has gone wrong deep within me and gets the better of me every time. And that's the Message version. That's the Apostle Paul. I think if any of us are honest, we share this experience to some degree in life. We desperately want to be great, beautiful people, and yet we let ourselves down. Can I mention two very unfashionable and frowned on words in these enlightened times? The first one is sin. Very simply, sin is disobeying or not conforming to God's law. It's that simple. Nothing more, nothing less. Conscience. I guess conscience is the recognition of sin and the burden of guilt and unease that goes with it. And I think we all feel that at times. You might not agree with me, but as humans, we seem to have this built-in understanding that there is something bigger than us. There is something bigger than us. There's something out there in the universe, we call it lots of different names. There's something out there in the universe that is bigger than us, that somehow brings order and meaning to our lives, yet our natural instinct is to rebel, to stamp our feet, to rush haphazardly through our lives until something bad happens, and then we collapse in misery and anxiety and self-pity. Every nation, every tribe has followed this path. There's a God-shaped hole in our hearts somewhere. And so we continue the search for freedom from the burdens of our actions, the inevitable burdens of our actions. We continue to search for redemption and meaning in our lives. The ancient Hebrews were allowed to enter into this covenant with God as they sought redemption. It's in the Old Testament. It's very hard for us to relate to this today, this covenant, but the result of this was an endlessly complicated regime of spiritual and moral laws or commandments to be obeyed. There's just this whole chapter in the Bible about 600 commandments to be obeyed. And then there was a whole series of ritualistic animal sacrifices to be performed in the very most holy place, the tabernacle, and later the temple. And it's to be performed by this special group of men who have been set aside to the task of priesthood. It's all described in the book of Leviticus. So at some level, this Levitical order, this treadmill of obedience and sacrifice, did help. At times, the people were very devout and serious in their intentions. They followed the God to their best ability. It gave some order to society. It laid down the rules and the guidelines that helped the health of the people of Israel. But it didn't ultimately bring liberty or freedom to your spirit personally. It was this obedience thing. Fast forward to our modern secular world that we live in today, which I think is actually very different than even it was 50 years ago for all of us who have been here more than 50 years. And we're encouraged today to find freedom in suppressing or denying those feelings of conscience. Put them behind us. Today we are urged to put aside those old ideas and set about pursuing gratification of self. Freedom is the entitlement to pursue or do anything we want that brings us happiness and fulfillment. Anything we want. It sounds attractive, it sounds fantastic. But unfortunately, this kind of freedom is giving us record levels of anxiety, record levels of depression, as well as personal, family and community dysfunction. Has anybody ever heard of Nick Cave? Nick Cave is an Australian rock legend. I'm becoming a huge admirer of him as I read his blog. He's my age and he's somehow survived despite his best efforts. He's was a long-term heroin addict, constantly on the edge of chaos and disorder in his head, a life of excess and stardom that goes with being a rock star. But in all this, through intense grief around 2 separate occasions, the death of his 2 sons, it just brought his whole world collapsing around him and he found God. And I'm a great follower of his blog. This week on his blog, he talked about true artistic freedom as a musician. People ask him questions, he gives the answers. And he said, disorder, randomness, chaos and anarchy are where the imagination goes to die, or so I've found. For a person who's lived that lifestyle, that's a big thing to say. Freedom, he said, finds itself in captivity and order. It's a strange thing to say, isn't it? He goes on to say, so it is with matters of faith and the freeness of belief. He said, I experience a certain vague spiritualness within the world of chaos, an approximate understanding of God that is implicit in some sort of latent metaphysical way, yet it is only in church, that profoundly fallible institution, that I become truly spiritually liberated. A strange thing for a rock star to say, isn't it? He said, I'm swept up in a poetic story that is both true and imaginative and fully participatory, where my spiritual imagination can be both contained and free. The church, he said, may appear to be as small, even stifling in our modern world, its congregation herd-like, yet within its architecture, music, litanies and stories, I find a place of immense spiritual recognition and liberation. How about that? No, he doesn't refer to the church. We all like talking about the church. He says in church. He's in church. In an act of submission and discipline, he has embraced God and in the process discovered recognition, meaning and liberation. The book of Hebrews that we read this morning is an intriguing book historically. We don't know for sure who wrote the book or who it was addressed to, but likely it was targeted to a Jewish audience. Pretty soon after the death of Christ, it's targeted to a Jewish audience. In the earliest days of Christian church, there was a lot of different books floating around, letters written, and in the process of forming the body of work that became the New Testament as we know it today, Hebrews made the cut. We don't know who wrote it, we don't know who wrote it to, but it made the cut. It was seen as a significant part of the New Testament. And Hebrews was deemed significant as it is pivotal in helping us understand the importance of the life and death of Jesus, the man, the resurrection of Jesus, Son of God, Son, man and God, and the recognition of Jesus' role in a new and lasting covenant between us and God. We start talking about the new covenant and the old covenant, new covenant. As I said before, this whole old covenant business, the blood of animals, and now the new covenant, the blood of Jesus, this whole concept is a bit lost on us because we're unfamiliar with those old Hebrew traditions. These words would have been absolutely mind-boggling and life-changing for its readers at the time, back in those earliest days. Very significantly, the writer emphasises that Jesus is the final revelation of God to his people. He says, this is it, you've got it all. You've got Jesus, it's in your hands. The curtain has been torn in half in the temple. The most significant thing to ever happen in the world has just happened. That's it, you've got it. Time has stood still, and incredibly, as we know, the calendar had been reset. Think about an event in the world that caused the calendar to be reset. The calendar of our life. God was no longer exclusively tied to the nation of Israel. Jesus, the new covenant, the new revelation, was free to all people, free to all of us. So in any quest for freedom of spirit, inevitably we are drawn back to the person of Jesus, who is the beginning of our quest. In our Mark readings over the recent weeks, we've been sampling moments of his sensational journey to Jerusalem. As we saw last week, it was punctuated by miraculous events, and it's interspersed with all that with increasingly tense meetings with the religious leaders. And in today's reading, he's actually in Jerusalem. And as I was kind of reflecting on last week's reading, this week's reading, I really felt a sense of foreboding, because we know the end of the story. We know the crucifixion and all the horrible stuff that went on just days after this story was recorded. And we know that these things would only be understood in his death and resurrection. So getting back to the old order, the old Hebrew story, the high priest had a critical role. He had to be set aside from the people, his people that he represented. He had to be merciful, he had to be faithful, and he was ultimately responsible for the blood sacrifices that gave a level of atonement for his people. There was a whole bunch of priests that used to do sacrifice and stuff, but the high priest was the man. He was the ultimate man between the people and God. Our Hebrews passage today is one really significant reference in the New Testament to ascribe Jesus the title of the high priest. Jesus the high priest. The writer goes into a lot of technical and theological detail on this. He points out that Jesus is the highest priest not through the Aaronic line, which was the people that did all the temple stuff in those days, but the order of Melchizedek. Go and read about Melchizedek. It's an interesting story. So Jesus is not just high priest, but he's the ultimate high priest in the order of Melchizedek. Timeless, indestructible. Very different from the high priest we saw in the Old Testament. Verses 13 and 14 of Hebrews there, it said, you would remember it, the blood of goats and bulls and ashes of a heifer sprinkled on those who are ceremonially unclean, sanctify them so they are outwardly clean. They're outwardly clean. How much more then will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself unblemished to God, how much more will he cleanse our consciences from acts that lead to death, so that we may serve the living God. Powerful words. So through his death, Jesus secured our redemption and opened the way for us to approach God with confidence and worship him in spirit and in truth and in freedom. Jesus did the time so that we may be free. And one of my big questions, which you might remind me about later on, was free to what? We crave this freedom. What are we free to do? And as we read in our reading this morning from Mark, verses 29 to 31, we're free to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength, and love your neighbour as yourself. Interesting that those were the key words that Jesus was talking about. And you'll have to go with me a bit in your imagination. I was racking my imagination and trying to work it out, but those words are the fence. Imagine yourself visualise yourself in an enclosure, and those words are the enclosure. It's a secure environment which we're able to be safe, to flourish, and prosper and find freedom of spirit. You can imagine the fenced-off playground that the kids all play in, fantastic rides and whatever in the middle, like at New Apex Park in Meriden. The child goes in the playground, inside the fence. They know they can relax, and they know that they'll be safe, and they can play hard, and everything will be great. I think that's what Jesus is talking about with those two verses. That's the safe place for us to put aside our hurts and our burdens and our damage. Doesn't matter who did it, how it happened, we've all got burdens and damage. And we can allow ourselves to be restored and be renewed, to start to become the people more like the person we have always created to be. Nick Cave is talking about freedom in confinement. Freedom in confinement. We know children prosper when they know the rules, when they know the boundaries. As children of God, we talk a lot about being freed, about being saved, about being redeemed. My challenge for everyone here today, including myself, is to walk the talk. We talk about freedom, being redeemed, and yet we cling to all those hurts and our damage and our anxieties and our depressions. We cling to them because they're safe to us. But we need to remember the fence. Stay inside the fence. Relax and be free. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind and with all your strength, and love your neighbour as yourself. That's the safe enclosure. And like Nick says, stay in church, prosper in church. There should be great encouragement and strength in worshipping together and expressing our faith together. That's what being in church is about. Stay inside the fence, hang out with your mates, be free. Amen.